Hey guys, it's Devest. Today I thought I would try to do a video talking about how erroneous opinions can become mainstream facts. So I have been reminded of the comparison between the Lewis gun and the MG08-15. The story goes that the Lewis gun was really good, and the MG08-15 was bad because it was heavier. Spoiler alert, the MG08-15 is actually way better. The meat of this video will be explaining why that is. I have two theories about where it came from. I think it could be British bias, since the Lewis gun was primarily used by the British. They needed a red herring to shut down any critical thought about the British being inferior to their enemies. And so by focusing on the weight, they have a nice simple thought-terminating cliché to stop any wrongthink. The other theory I have involves a machine gun collector, similarly divorced from the real-world application of these weapons, and didn't like the ergonomics of the MG08-15 compared to the Lewis gun. Then his opinion got elevated with false authority. So the first point I need to address is the idea that the MG08-15 was heavier than the Lewis gun. On paper it is, because the 08-15 is 5 kilograms heavier than the Lewis. But that's only in a vacuum, without considering the weight of ammunition. Each Lewis gun magazine weighs around 800 grams empty. With 47 rounds fully loaded, that means 235 rounds of Lewis gun ammunition, weighs 4 kilograms more than a 250-round MG08 belt. Hey guys! I realized I made an error in this script while editing. I started talking about the weight of magazines in a vacuum, instead of focusing on real-world use. In the real world, a Lewis gun team consisted of 6 men each carrying 8 magazines, for 2,256 rounds in total, while an MG08-15 team consisted of 4 men, carrying 2,600 rounds between them, mostly in 250-round belts. The gunner and assistant carried 2 each, and the ammo bearers each carried 3 of those belts. There was also a 100-round belt loaded into a box hanging off the receiver for maneuvers. So if both guns were air-cooled, then the magazines on the Lewis would demand 50% more manpower, for the same firepower as the 08-15. But since the 15 is water-cooled, it has a much greater practical rate of fire. Now back to my original script. In practical terms, the only weight saving a Lewis gunner would have is from a massive reduction in effective firepower. If the Lewis team carried 21 Lewis magazines, to match the 4 belts carried by an MG08-15 team, the total weight of the system would be 30 kilograms, compared to 20 kilograms with the 08-15 barrel jacket full of water. So the only way the Lewis saved weight was with reduced ammunition capacity. Additionally, both the Lewis and 08-15 were operated by 2-man teams, and you couldn't really shoulder either of them like rifles. So in the real world, the only difference was the greater volume of fire from the 08-15. Whereas something like the Shosha could be used as a rifle to somewhat compensate for its inferior volume of fire. In fact, the real comparison for the MG08-15 isn't against the Lewis, but against contemporary tripod-mounted heavy machine guns. The heavy machine guns famous during the First World War, like the MG08 and Vickers, were designed based on real-world experience in maneuver warfare, which the Japanese had validated with their victory over the Russians. So machine guns were expected to be deployed in natural terrain and used as artillery, or to free up bodies for infantry to go on the offensive. They didn't consider what conditions in the trenches would look like. It just so happened that pre-war light machine gun designs, such as the Lewis gun, intended for horse-mounted infantry, were well suited for trench warfare. Most people already understand that heavy machine guns are poor offensive weapons in the trenches, necessitating the adoption of light machine guns. But heavy machine guns also had their downsides on the defense too. The problem is that you couldn't shoulder these guns like a rifle, so you couldn't use them from a normal firing trench. You had to dig out a special position for the machine gun to operate from in the trench. But it requires extra labor, there's a limited angle of fire, and it would be a conspicuous spot for the enemy to identify and target when they chose to launch their attack. In addition, mounting those machine guns was oftentimes a semi-permanent affair, where they had to sit them into position ready to fire, because they would physically bury the mount under dirt and sandbags to keep it from knocking itself out of position due to the powerful recoil, which meant they were more vulnerable to getting destroyed or focused down by snipers. Using a shoulder-fired bipod-mounted machine gun meant that you had a gun that you could use from the fire trench, which made it much more difficult to spot and destroy. And so the British had an advantage with the Lewis early in the trench war, since the Lewis was faster firing than a Lee Enfield and could be used in the same position. The genius of the MG08-15 was that it combined the firepower of a water-cooled machine gun with a design that was conducive to trench warfare, effectively merging the benefits of the heavy and light machine guns into a single weapon. In practical terms, it's the first general-purpose machine gun. The only real downsides compared to the original MG08 was that you couldn't use the 15 for indirect fire, and it couldn't mount an optic. Compared to the Lewis gun, the downsides are even less noteworthy. It has harsher recoil due to using the same action as a Maxim gun, compared to the very forward-thinking Lewis gas piston system. You might also argue that the bipod being placed near the center of gravity instead of the muzzle is bad, but that was done specifically so it would be easier to aim in a trench, even if it does cause more muzzle flip. Now some of you might be saying, but what about the stormtroopers? They used captured Lewis guns. True, but like I mentioned before, any machine gun, even the Chauchat, is better than a bolt-action rifle. So of course they pushed everything into frontline service when possible to increase their firepower. In addition, the use of captured machine guns on the offensive meant that the stormtroopers could take captured ammunition from their enemies to supply their machine guns, instead of having to move ammunition over no man's land to defend against the inevitable counterattack. Another major advantage of the MG08-15 is that it was significantly cheaper to produce than the MG08. Since it didn't require a complicated mount, they were able to field more machine guns than they would have otherwise been able to. So overall, the MG08-15 was probably one of the best small arms ever devised, both within the context of how it was used in the real world and for its influence down the line. It somehow managed to increase the firepower of infantry, increase their mobility, protect them from artillery and snipers, and it was cheaper than the systems it replaced. I don't think any of the well-regarded German small arms were ever able to do all of that. For instance, the Dries needle rifle did everything, but it was way more expensive than a muzzle-loaded rifle, while the MG42 didn't do anything better than the MG34, but it was significantly cheaper. So that's all I wanted to say about the machine guns of the First World War today. But I had an idea for a smell test you can use in the future to quickly determine fact from fiction on your own. I call it the Britcope test, which is a process where you take a narrative about any piece of military technology, not just British, and look at how much influence it has on later technology. So for the Lewis gun, you just need to ask, does anyone, including the Brits, still use something like the Lewis gun? Or do they use something more like the MG08-15 instead? If you wanted a modern rendition of the Lewis gun, you could take a 7.62 NATO AR-15, like the Patriot Ordnance Revolution DI because of its lightweight, put a heavy barrel and bipod on it, load it with 50-round drum magazines, and use that as your squad automatic weapon. But in the real world, everyone uses belt-fed machine guns like the FN-MAG instead, because they are capable of a higher volume of fire for the same weight. We can use this method on other systems too. I've heard that the British Brodie helmet was the best helmet of the First World War because its wide brim protected the user from shrapnel. How many wide-brimmed military helmets do we see in use today? None. Do British soldiers still use wide-brimmed helmets? Nope. Therefore, this narrative is Britcope. Beyond this simple yes or no question, if you need deeper analysis because of curiosity or because of an argument you're having, you can always ask me about it. For example, the Brodie helmet. World War I helmets were designed based on national aesthetics instead of efficacy. The Brodie helmet had a wide brim, not because they thought it was effective, but because it resembled medieval kettle helmets popular in England. For the same reason, the American Expeditionary Force used Brodie and Adrian helmets because they were easier to tell, apart from the Stahlhelm compared to their own experimental helmet designs, which were also based on medieval helmets. Also, a wide brim wouldn't help to protect the head against the threats of the First World War. Helmets mostly protected against shrapnel, which unlike in video games came in at a low angle. Artillery pieces like 77mm field guns would fire shrapnel shells at low angles. Then, based on the fuse, they were intended to detonate mid-air, projecting large shotgun pellets ahead of them, also at a near horizontal angle. Instead of coming in overhead, the shrapnel would be coming at a mostly horizontal angle to the men in the trenches. After the First World War, everyone started shifting towards designing helmets based on performance rather than aesthetics. The British were a bit slower, but by the middle of the Second World War, they replaced the Brodie with the more conventional Mark III helmet. Thanks for listening. Make sure to argue with me in the comment below if you disagree or if you want me to explain the results of other Britcope tests. Until next time, this has been Divest.